In the Bible, we find everything we need for life and for godliness. What we see is the Bible addresses so many aspects of our lives, even today, for how we are to live as a Christian people. This includes our work. We're continuing these midweek devotions, this midweek in the Word, looking at the issue of grace and unity as it's applied to the different spheres, the different relationships in our life. We've spent the last several weeks looking at the home, looking at the relationship between husbands and wives, and then as parents and children, those relationships there within the home. And here's the next step out from that, the relationships within authority structures in our lives and in our society, specifically those of work. We're going to continue reading in Ephesians chapter 6, looking at specifically verses 5 through 9 today. Hear the word of the Lord. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service or as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. This is the word of the Lord. The main point I want you to see is we need to live as a Christian in the authority structures of the world, both in positions of authority and positions under authority. And the big pink elephant in the room here that we need to talk about first is this specific passage is addressing bondservants. And many translations will translate that as slaves. In our day and age, the understanding of slavery is quite different than what it was there in the first century. And many people even attack the Bible because it speaks to issues like this, how slaves are to serve as slaves without any sort of understanding of the context therein. What we have to realize in Ephesus specifically, the city, the church to whom this was written, about 30% of the population were slaves. Slaves were integral parts of many family structures. They were almost family members as slaves there within that context. But one big distinction we have to understand is slavery in the first century was not a racial or ethnic issue. Slavery in the first century was an economic issue. It was a class of people. It was an economic bracket of people who decided they would be better off by selling themselves in servitude to another than they could trying to make it on their own. It was an economic issue, not a racial or ethnic issue, as is commonly thought of in our day from our own recent history in the last 400 to 500 years of the American experiment here in our nation. And so what we realize is that slavery was viewed quite differently in that day and age, but at the same time, slaves had little to no rights. They could be beaten, they could be abused, they could be sold, they could even be killed at the hand of their master. But the faithful teaching and application of passages like this and others similar in the Bible is ultimately what led to the abolition of slavery in the modern world. The right application of this, consistent application of passages like this, led to the near elimination of slavery, even in times of antiquity, through the influence of biblical Christianity. The Bible never condones slavery as good or right. Rather, the recurring emphasis is of our equality before God. So, the application for us, as we understand the principles of the passage, is that we're looking at how we serve rightly as employees and how we govern rightly as employers in the job sphere or in school or perhaps a coach of a team, the structures of community and society where we find authority and those under that authority. And we see these instructions given to both sides of that equation. Those under authority, the clear instruction is to obey those in authority. The key for Paul is not simply to obey, but more so how you obey. He expounds this in great detail. Again, look at verse 5. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. He says, continuing in verse 6, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. He says, don't serve superficially, not in the way of eye service as people pleasers. You know, one of the things I've always found ironic is radar detectors. Many people have them and use them in their cars. They're zooming down the interstate and the radar detector goes off, so they slow down so that when someone's watching, they're doing the right thing. I find radar detectors to be a little bit ironic in the sense of they allow you to get out of a ticket often, yes, but they don't keep you from doing what's illegal, doing what's wrong, keeping the law. So Paul here is saying, don't simply obey when people are watching. Don't obey in a superficial, surface-level manner, but with a heart of sincerity. Obey with sincerity, a sincere heart, doing God's will from the heart, serving with good will. This is the opposite of superficiality. Your obedience must be rooted in a heart that desires to do what's right, a heart that desires to obey well. The sincere heart not only cares about the job, but about doing the job well in a timely manner with great care. You know, it's easy to make comparisons with Chick-fil-A. If you visit a Chick-fil-A, everything that they do for you is their pleasure. In fact, they're taught how to respond with that anytime someone says, thank you. It's my pleasure. Years ago, I was in a Pollo Tropical, and they have these T-shirts that are indicative of their food and their menu. And one of them said Salsa Queen. And the lady wearing it really did not want me there. It was not her pleasure that I was there, and it was clear and obvious to everyone in line. She did not want to be there, and she did not want us to be there. She was doing her job. She was on the clock getting paid, but it was not with a sincerity of heart. It was not seeking to do the job well. It was not seeking to honor God in doing that, because ultimately that's the high standard that Paul calls us to. He says, do this as a servant of Christ. He says, with fear and trembling, as you would Christ, as servants of Christ, as unto the Lord. Colossians echoes this when Paul's writing to the Colossians. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 24, he says very similarly, knowing from the Lord you receive your inheritance as your reward, you are serving the Lord Christ. But here's the question. How does my serving an earthly authority like a boss equal serving Christ? Well, Paul writes to the Thessalonians, instructing them how to live godly lives. He says, and aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent upon no one. So there's an example that's being displayed to those who are not in the faith. Peter says to his hearers in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 through 16, but even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason the hope that is within you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. In other words, they shouldn't be able to say anything negative about you. Specifically speaking, our discussion today, in the context of your work, other than you honor Christ. Paul makes it abundantly clear in his letter to Titus, chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, bondservants are to be submissive to their own masters in everything. They're to be well-pleasing, not argumentative, not pilfering, but showing all good faith, so that in everything they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior. The gospel is adorned beautifully as you serve well as unto the Lord. As you work as unto Christ, the gospel is made beautiful through your life and action, your testimony. Serving rightly under authority displays your faith. Every group under authority has a complaining crowd. I've been around them, you've been around them. As a Christian, you ought not be in that complaining crowd. Your testimony is on trial and indeed on display before those in authority over you. And Paul reminds us and encourages us that God will judge everything. Look again at verse 8. Knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is bondservant or is free. He says, knowing this. It was common knowledge. Matthew 16:27. For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. No good will go unrewarded. Colossians 3:25 reminds us that no evil will go unpunished, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. God will reward and punish, so you don't have to worry about getting your due recognition. Trust God and get to work. You see, the vast majority of Christians will find themselves under authority. And how you obey that authority is vital to your testimony. Paul doesn't stop there. He continues by speaking to those who are over authority, those exercising authority, and he calls them to be just and fair. Colossians chapter 4, verse 1 echoes this when he says, Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Just and fair, the same things as those who are under authority. You are called as those with authority to treat those under authority with the same respect and care and justice and honor as those who are under authority treating you. He says here in verse 9, Masters, do the same to them. Stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality. Simply because there is a secular authority structure doesn't mean you need to act like the world. Paul's saying, those of you in charge, boss, you need to treat those under you Christianly. Jesus even goes so far in Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 44 to say this, and Jesus called them to him and said to them, You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. When you find yourself in authority, your Christianity there too is on display. It's on trial. So don't abuse your authority. He says, stop threatening. You know, severity may result in external obedience, but it never captures the heart. The old saying goes, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. Show kindness. Show compassion. Love those who are under you as Christ has loved you. The goal should be to make obedience the joyful work of those under your authority. The master of all is in heaven, and all stand equal before him. Even those in authority will be judged for how they use that authority. The Bible speaks to every area of life, even the work you're going to today. So we need to live out our faith when the societal structure doesn't see it as necessary or normal to live that way. For those who are under authority, obey as unto Christ. Those over authority, those with authority, be just and fair and treat others Christianly, even from your position of authority. Let us let grace and unity permeate every dynamic of our lives.